Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White and today we are moving on to lecture 20, which is going to be focusing on Cenozoic life. Alright, let's get going. So, through the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, evolution produced a range of, quite interesting animals, some of them quite weird. However, by the Cenozoic, the flora and fauna present would be far more recognizable to us. We'd be able to walk around and we'd think, okay, that looks like something I can equate to a modern animal. But let's not forget that the Cenozoic is 66 million years long, and it's getting bigger every day. So there's still, there was plenty of time for significant changes to take place in the Earth's biota. So during the Cenozoic, the mammals, birds, and angiosperms, if you remember the angiosperms are the flowering plants, recovered from the Cretaceous Tertiary impact and quickly diversified to fill the niches left by the dinosaurs, the flying reptiles, the marine reptiles, etc. So there's a very interesting fact when we are dealing with Cenozoic fossils, and this is something which we refer to as the pull of the recent. And this means that the fossil record for the Cenozoic is particularly extensive, and that the evolutionary history for many of the species is near complete, although annoyingly so, not for humans. So the pull of the recent simply means that sediments and the fossils within those sediments that were laid down relatively recently have had less time to be destroyed. And so that means there's a lot more rock around and there's a lot more fossils within that rock, and those fossils are in better condition. And so that essentially means that it's far easier to find fossils from the Cenozoic versus fossils from the Mesozoic or the Paleozoic. So we have a much better fossil record for the Cenozoic versus the Mesozoic or the Paleozoic. Alright, so let's start in the oceans. So let's start off with marine invertebrates and the phytoplankton. So the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction event caused the loss of numerous marine species, with the ammonites. I'm sure you remember the ammonites are the coiled cephalopods, and the rudists. Rudists are a type of horn-shaped bivalve that made up the majority of the Mesozoic reefs. Those are probably the two species, two best-known marine species that went extinct. During the end of the Mesozoic. So we should also remember that single-celled organisms like foraminifera, coccolithophores, diatoms, dinoflagellates all took a real beating. In the case of the coccolithophores, diatoms, and dinoflagellates, they photosynthesize. So all of a sudden, if you imagine a huge meteorite comes in, you get a nuclear winter, they're going to be in trouble. And so obviously that means that there were significant losses within those populations, within those families. However, they made it through. A few different species managed to survive, and after the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction event was over, they began to essentially evolve again, and they began to reconquer the areas which they had lived in during the Mesozoic. And of course, they are very, very important. They're the primary producers, so they're the base of the modern marine food chain, essentially. So once they recovered, foraminifera, radiolarians, corals, bryozoans, mollusks, echinoderms, all these different types of invertebrates have become especially prolific. Okay, so these are the organisms that make up the vast majority of the invertebrate populations you'll find in the modern oceans. So, furthermore, the continental distribution and changes in the global climate and ocean currents produced by the the movement of the continents produced latitudinal temperature gradients that were not present during the Mesozoic, and this caused marine organisms to become more provincial compared to those in the Mesozoic. So in the Mesozoic, especially during the Triassic and the Jurassic, the oceans were relatively homogenized. So that means an organism could live, in the equator, and it also means that organism could probably live relatively comfortably in what we would consider to be the modern-day temperate band, for instance. Now, nowadays, on the other hand, you will have certain, let's say certain types of foraminifera that like to live in the modern-day temperate band, and you'll have certain types of foraminifera that like to live in the tropics, because the temperature difference between those two environments is now far greater. And that's all the result of changes in the continental position and the changes in ocean circulation that it's caused. So in the early Cenozoic, coccolithophores, diatoms, and dinoflagellates all recovered pretty rapidly. with diatoms becoming especially numerous and diverse during the Miocene. And you can see back here, just it's a bit difficult to see, but this is actually a picture down a microscope of numerous different diatom shells. So you can see all the varying sizes, significant variation in shape. I mean, you've got triangles, ellipses, circles. Quite a big range depending on the species. So this sudden explosion in the diatoms is likely a reflection of the lack of competition caused by the loss of other phytoplankton due to the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction. So essentially they had a situation where the field was pretty clear for them and they just went for it. So we also have, at the same time, we see these changes in ocean temperature also taking place. And this meant we had reduced ocean water temperatures at higher latitudes. So as you move towards the north and south poles, the water was getting colder. And obviously organisms like foraminifera, dinoflagellates, and coccolithophores, on the whole, don't like cold water conditions. Now, diatoms, on the other hand, they are absolutely fine with cold water conditions. And so all this cold water towards the poles was the perfect environment for them. And so this meant that during the Miocene, the diatoms became extremely numerous, and they were also possibly helped by increased volcanism, especially in the northern hemisphere, especially in the North Pacific. So if we think of an area where we very commonly find diatoms now, a great example would be somewhere around the Aleutian Islands. Essentially, that's that chain of islands that goes from Alaska across the North Pacific over to Russia. And that's an environment that's very, very volcanically active. So the water's very, very cold up there, which is perfect for diatoms. And there's also lots and lots of volcanic eruptions in that area, which throws lots and lots of very, very fine dust into the atmosphere. And a lot of that dust falls into the ocean. And a small portion of that dust will slowly begin to dissolve into the seawater. And so that means the seawater in that area will have silica in it, SiO2. And it's silica that diatoms use to make their shells. And so that's the kind of perfect environment for diatoms. And we see, the diatoms during that period start, in areas which are volcanically active, really, really doing very well. And in some cases, the diatoms were actually so abundant that when they were dying, they died in such large numbers that the accumulation of their shells was such that it actually allowed a type of rock to build up just from diatom shells, which is called a diatomite. And this is actually a piece of it here. You can see it looks rather unspectacular. It should be familiar to us, though, as something called diatomaceous earth, which is something you might use in a number of different methods. It's particularly commonly used in things like pest control, especially in gardens. So in terms of the foraminifera, so if you remember, they are zooplankton, so they're actually they're carnivorous single-celled organisms, and foraminifera became extremely common in the warm waters of the Tethys Ocean during the Cenozoic. So if you remember, the Tethys Ocean is located approximately where the modern-day Indian Ocean is. And so the Tethys Ocean was destroyed because the Tethys Ocean seafloor was subducted underneath Asia, and obviously as part of that, India moved north. So obviously it's been replaced by the new Indian Ocean seafloor. However, during the early Cenozoic, the remainder of the Tethys Ocean had nice warm water, and as such, it became a perfect environment for foraminifera. Just so the modern Indian Ocean, I should also say, is also quite a good environment for modern foraminifera as well. So during the Mesozoic, we see the corals, which during the Mesozoic had been outcompeted by the rudists. They become the dominant reef-forming organisms. So the Skeletarian corals make their move in the Cenozoic. So when we're talking about corals now, we're talking about the kind of organisms that we would think of as corals. So the extinction of the rudists allowed corals to very quickly become the dominant reef-building organism. So as soon as the rudists were gone, once again, field was clear, the Skeletarian corals just went for it, and now they are the dominant reef-building organism. So corals have become especially common in warm water environments, especially in the Indo-Pacific and the Caribbean regions. Along with corals, we see bryozoans, and other fellow suspension feeders, particularly crinoids, have increased during the early and middle Cenozoic, although they have become a little less common as water temperatures have decreased slowly throughout the Cenozoic. So what we see in the early Cenozoic and the middle Cenozoic is we see the bryozoans, for example up here, and the crinoids, who have been around for a very, very long time. There's two groups that have been around for a fair while. They initially do very, very well in the Cenozoic. Once again, the rudists have gone. And so this means that, not only the corals, but also the bryozoans and the crinoids have the opportunity to, essentially grow a little bit. There's less competition around. So they can, begin to increase their population numbers, increase the number of species in their groups. And we see initially they do quite well. And then we begin to see that as global temperatures begin to decrease towards the middle to end of the middle to the late Cenozoic, we see that numbers of bryozoans and crinoids have dropped off slightly. Not a huge decrease, but enough to be noticed. And, we can see, when we look at the fossil record, this is an example of a fossil bryozoan here. You can see relatively similar to this modern example there. And you can see here's a fossilized crinoid. Of course, if you remember, we have the stem, the bulb, the arms, and we can see in this particular fossil, which is a very nice example, we actually have the feather-like appendages which help to catch the food. And of course, the food gets passed back down the arm towards the essentially the main mass of the crinoid here, where it will be digested. So, in terms of shelly organisms during the Cenozoic, they've become dominated by bivalves and gastropods. Now, the bivalves had established themselves all the way back after the Permo-Trias mass extinction. So about 252 million years ago, if you remember, there was a big extinction event. Before that extinction event, the brachiopods had actually been dominant over the bivalves. After the Permo-Trias mass extinction, on the other hand, the bivalves were dominant over the brachiopods. And the bivalves have never really lost that position since. Now, the one thing we do see during the Cenozoic is we do see the rise of the gastropods. So the gastropods would be known to you and me as sea snails. And we begin to see the number of gastropod species take a pretty big jump. And honestly, I'm not exactly sure why that is. I'm going to assume it's due to a factor of decreased competition after the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction. But anyway, the moral of the story is the gastropods have been doing very, very well for themselves over the past 66 million years. We see the brachiopods, they're still around, but they continue to play a relatively minor role when it comes to the ocean marine fauna. So, they're really not that important. We see that the nautiloids, the squid and the octopi, begin to fill the void left by other nectonic invertebrates that became extinct during the Permo-Trias mass extinction, particularly the ammonites and the belemnites. So when those two groups are gone, all of a sudden we have the opportunity for especially the squid and the octopi to begin to take over the niches left by the loss of the ammonites. And of course, we also see that as the ammonites disappear, we see that some of those niches that they leave behind were actually then taken over by the fish. So, the fish managed to begin to dominate, especially in the upper portion of the ocean column, and in the lower, darker regions, it became dominated by the squid and the octopi, especially the squid. We also see the group Echinodermata, so the echinoderms, the sea urchins, recover from the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction, and they have also established themselves as an important epifaunal organism. So they typically live on the seafloor, although some of them have also adapted to live in the infaunal environment, that's essentially in the seafloor sediments. And in both cases, they have become extremely successful. So they're doing very well for themselves as well. Okay, so that was a very quick run through the oceans. So what was going on in terms of vegetation and climate? So as we've discussed, the Cenozoic has seen a general cooling trend. So if we look at this graph over here, so this is 66 million years ago here. This is the present day here. And these are delta oxygen 18 values. Okay, so you'll see the number is getting higher as we are moving towards the present day, and that suggests that the global climate is getting colder. So over the past 66 million years, we have seen global climate steadily getting colder and colder and colder. So that general trend is reflected in what we see when it comes to the plant life. So the oxygen 18, oxygen 16 data from deep sea sediments indicates a global warming around the Paleocene, Eocene boundary. Here's the Paleocene, here's the Eocene. We have a period of high global temperatures here, and that's typically referred to as the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum. And it seems that around this time, the circulation of warmer tropical waters into higher latitudes actually went and stalled. And what happened is this caused deep ocean water in the tropics to become warmer. So think about it this way. Typically what happens is warm water from the tropics moves either north or south away from the equator towards the poles, where it becomes colder, it becomes denser, so it sinks, it moves back along the seafloor towards the equator again. So we have this non-stop cycle going on. Warm water moves north or south, becomes colder, heads back towards the equator. Now, what we think happens around the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum is this circulation either stops altogether or slows down significantly. Now, this means that the warm water from the tropics is no longer heading north or south to cool off, and so that means the water temperature in the tropics starts to get higher and higher and higher. Or more importantly, the water towards the bottom of the water column in the tropical regions starts to get warmer and warmer and warmer because it's not being replaced by colder water coming from the poles. And so what's the problem? You're thinking, well, okay, fine, man, that doesn't really sound that bad. And one of the reasons we know, by the way, that the water temperature has to be going up during this period is we see that there is a decrease in the number of deep sea foraminifera in the tropical regions. These are foraminifera that would live in the tropical regions very, very deep in the water column, and they typically liked relatively cool water temperatures. And so we suddenly see around this time their populations take a real hit. And so all of a sudden we see their numbers drop, and so that would suggest rather strongly that the deep marine temperatures are increasing and they're finding conditions unacceptable, and so the species are dying out. So there is another factor that needs to be taken into account. Now, if we look at this over here and this map here, what's this map showing? It's showing you the location of gas hydrate deposits. So gas hydrates are essentially a mixture of methane and water mixed together to form a crystal. Now, gas hydrates are stable when they're on the seafloor and there's a lot of water above them. So that means there's a very high pressure, and they also are stable when they're under relatively cool temperatures. So gas hydrates like high pressures and cool temperatures. So in all these environments you're seeing here, these are environments where right down on the seafloor the temperature is relatively low, the pressure is relatively high because there's so much water above them, and so that means any methane in that area will combine with the water from the seawater and they'll form gas hydrates. Now you'll notice that a substantial quantity of these gas hydrate deposits are located either 30 degrees north or south of the equator, in the area that we would kind of consider to be the tropics. So you can probably guess what's about to happen. Obviously, at this Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when deep water temperatures begin to get higher in this region here, obviously we've lost one of the two factors that helps to keep the gas hydrates stable, and so the gas hydrates start to break down. And if you watch this video here, you'll see a sample of a piece of gas hydrate that's just been drilled off the seafloor, literally bubbling and effervescing away and disappearing into the atmosphere, because they can't exist at the Earth's surface because the pressure's too low and the temperature's too high. So it is Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. It looks like the deep marine temperatures started to go up. The gas hydrates became unstable. And obviously what's going to happen is the gas hydrate is going to start breaking down, and they're going to release very large quantities of methane. And as I'm sure you know, methane is a very serious greenhouse gas. I think it's somewhere in the region of about 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so, obviously, as these gas hydrate deposits break down, releasing significant quantities of methane into the atmosphere, it obviously will have led to a very sudden increase in the atmosphere's ability to retain heat, courtesy of the greenhouse effect. And this will have meant that all of a sudden, global temperatures will have spiked. And so, obviously, then what we see is the gas hydrate supply essentially breaking down, methane goes into the atmosphere. We see methane still going in, still going in, still going in, and then all of a sudden we see the gas hydrate supply begin to become exhausted. That means less methane's in the atmosphere now. It means the methane that is there is being stripped out. And so over time we see the amount of methane in the atmosphere dropping again, and we see temperatures returning to normal. So North America during the Paleocene and Eocene had tropical conditions. So North America, the vast majority of North America during that time period was, relatively tropical. So you would have had, lots of very thick, dense forest. So at the end of the Eocene, we see a rapid decrease in temperature, and there's an average temperature decrease of up to about 7 Celsius in 3 million years in North America. Okay, that's a pretty quick decrease in temperature. So 7 Celsius dropping off over about 3 million years, that for most plants is a bit of a shock. And so what we see as the temperature begins to decrease, we obviously have the loss of this thick tropical forest, which existed during the Paleocene and the Eocene. We see it dying out as we head into the Oligocene. Okay, before we talk any more, let's pause here. So, as usual, pause the presentation, get up, have a walk around, go and get a glass of water, and please come back in a few minutes. So, excuse me. So this decrease from this Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, as discussed, is probably caused by the exhaustion of the gas hydrate deposits, and in all likelihood also the return of ocean circulation. So the cold water from the poles started to move back down towards the tropics, and all of a sudden deep water temperatures in the tropical regions began to decrease. So the deep water got colder again. So we see that temperatures across North America and globally remain steady throughout the Oligocene and the Miocene, but decrease during the Pliocene. Okay, so here we go. So as we can see, global temperature throughout the Oligocene and the Miocene, yes, there is some variation there, but on the whole, if you take an average, it's a relatively flat line. As you can see, if you go from here to here, the average itself is going to be relatively flat. So on the whole, average temperatures during the Oligocene and Miocene were relatively stable, and then as we go into the middle to late Miocene, into the Pliocene and Pleistocene, we can see the temperatures have been steadily dropping off. So we've gone from essentially tropical conditions in North America up here, into more temperate conditions here, and then steadily, in some areas, into more boreal forest conditions down here, especially in the northern states of the US. So, as I say, temperatures across North America and globally remain steady during the Oligocene and Miocene, decreased during the Pliocene and Pleistocene. So, over the past 25 million years, so 25 million years ago, essentially is around here, around the Oligocene-Miocene boundary. The past 25 million years, the mid-continent region of North America has undergone a steady decrease in precipitation. So, over the past 25 million years, the center of North America has been getting drier. And so this caused the vast continental forests of the Oligocene to give way to what would be classified as more savanna conditions. That's grassland with rather scattered scrubby trees. So, if you've ever been, if you haven't driven out towards, San Antonio or Austin in that direction, you've gone through hill country, that's more the kind of conditions you're looking at. Lots of scrubby grass with sparse trees all over the place. And that's a reflection of an environment that has relatively low rainfall. And over time, this savanna-like conditions actually gave way, and we finally ended up with what's referred to as a steppe environment in some places. So conditions became extremely dry, verging on near desert. And, those type of environments, think of places like New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, those kind of states. So during the Cenozoic, the angiosperms, the flowering plants, continued their diversification, although seedless vascular plants and gymnosperms also remained important. So if you remember, gymnosperms, essentially the main environment they dominate now are in the high latitude environments towards the poles, especially in the northern hemisphere, where they form the boreal forest, and that's an environment that's dominated typically by conifer trees. And the conifer is a type of gymnosperm. And so that's where they managed to establish their population, and that's a population that's relatively safe because typically angiosperms can't really survive in those conditions relatively well because they're too cold. It's too cold. In the case of the seedless vascular plants, they have established themselves in environments that tend to be relatively warm and humid. And so, think of places, like Florida, or any kind of tropical environment. Those are environments where the seedless vascular plants are managing to hold on. Everywhere else, pretty much though, angiosperms dominate, and I think they account for somewhere in the region of 90+% of all plants that are around now. So as the more uniform temperature distribution of the Mesozoic ended, the establishment of distinct zones affected the distribution of plant varieties. Excuse me for just 1 second. So as we head into the Cenozoic, we begin to see that we have all these regional variations, and so we have shifts in the type of plants that we get. So remember that during the Mesozoic, once again, global temperature was relatively homogenized, and so that means that plants that could live in equatorial environments could also live in relatively high latitude environments. So you get the same plant over huge areas of the Earth. As the temperature gradient began to shift and the poles began to become colder, so that meant that a temperate zone began to form and these more tropical conditions got compressed towards the modern day equator, it obviously meant that these plants could no longer exist in those environments, and so they died out. So let's look at a good example. So plants in warmer, more humid conditions tend to have large leaves with a smooth margin and a pointed drip tip to remove precipitation. So this is the kind of leaf shape you would expect to see when you're dealing with tropical plants. So the leaf is big to maximize sunlight gathering. The leaf itself is relatively smooth, and it has a drip tip to get rid of water because they typically exist in environments that tend to have relatively high amounts of rainfall. And obviously, when you're a leaf, you don't want anything on you that's going to possibly inhibit your capacity to gather sunlight. Even water droplets on a leaf actually help to affect the amount of sunlight a leaf can gather, and as such, these plants are designed to channel the water straight down the middle of the leaf, and the water goes straight over the drip tip here and just falls to the ground. So it means the leaf is on the whole relatively water-free. So these are leaves that are designed for hot, humid environments. In contrast, plants from cooler and drier zones tend to have much smaller leaves with incised margins and no drip tips. And this will help to reduce water loss, and in some cases it actually helps to funnel rain towards the stem of the plant. So it helps the plant to essentially retain as much water as possible. And that's because these plants are existing in environments where the annual rainfall tends to be lower. And as such, you need to limit the amount of water that you're losing. So the leaves become a lot smaller because big leaves actually lose a lot of water due to evaporation. But that doesn't matter because if you're in a tropical region, there's plenty of water in the ground that the roots can suck up to replace the water that gets lost through evaporation. However, in the case of trees, for instance, in a temperate region, like an oak tree, that's dealing with an environment where the amount of water is far more variable, typically relatively high in the winter and the autumn, much lower in the spring and the summer. And so the leaves are designed with that in mind, and so they are designed to limit the amount of water loss that the leaf will actually undergo. So they tend to be a lot smaller. So what we'll notice is as global temperatures get cooler, we will see tropical plants like this are replaced by tropical plants that have leaves like this. So if we look at this graph over here, it's showing us the percentage of smoothed margin species, so tropical leafed plants, in 4 different locations: Mississippi, Northern California, Pacific Northwest, and Southern Alaska. And as you can see, we've got Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, and Pleistocene over here. Okay, and over here we have the inferred annual mean temperature. So what you're going to notice is, of course, as we go, especially from Northern California, the Pacific Northwest, and Southern Alaska, we're obviously going to see the temperature dropping as we move throughout the Cenozoic towards the present day. Now, you'll notice in the case of the smooth margined plant species from the Mississippi embayment, you'll see that on the whole, if you take an average, the average abundance is relatively high, and that's showing us that the conditions in that area have remained constantly, on the whole, relatively warm, relatively humid from the Paleocene all the way through to the Oligocene. So everything there was perfectly okay. Now, what we begin to notice as we look at Northern California, the Pacific Northwest, and Southern Alaska, you'll see that initially things are looking good during the Eocene, and then as we head into the Oligocene, bang, straight down. So that's showing us, as we cross from the Eocene into the Oligocene, there is a noticeable decrease in global temperature, and as such, that means the tropics, essentially, which were quite expansive during the Paleocene and the Eocene, begin to contract and move towards the equator, and obviously that means the temperate zone begins to become a lot larger, and so we see these tropical plants are replaced by more temperate plants. And we can see that's obviously especially strong in areas like Southern Alaska. That's not a huge shock, where these smooth leaf plants only make up, somewhere in the region of about 10% of the plants by the Oligocene-Miocene boundary, and they pretty much make up none of the population now, because obviously the temperature gets so low. So we can see that, we can see the changes in these areas that are, we can see changes in this area that clearly show us that global temperature changes are happening. However, in some environments like the Mississippi embayment, we can see that some areas which are essentially more humid, more constantly warm, are protected. So a good example would be somewhere like the Gulf region, which on the whole is a relatively warm, relatively humid environment. I mean, we have, nice, warm, humid summers, and we have relatively mild, still relatively humid winters. And so that means the environment is still pretty good for smooth, margined leafed plants, and so that means they make up a reasonable proportion of the plant population in this area, especially around the coast. However, in other areas that started to dry out a bit and temperatures dropped, we see that their proportion begins to decrease. So fossil plants from the western interior of North America indicate that during the Paleocene, Eocene, and early Oligocene, the area contained palm and fern trees, indicating a warm, humid environment. So, it would have had a rainforest-esque appearance. So in Colorado, the 100 or so Paleocene species of trees that have been identified, 70 of them have been smooth-margined trees. So should I say trees that have smooth margined leaves, many with drip tips, suggesting that the environment was, as I said, rainforest-like. We see that this forest died back as the climate got cooler and drier from the early Oligocene onwards. This is, that's a nice example. If you go to Colorado now, the idea that that area would ever have been covered in a rainforest-like environment wouldn't really compute. However, in the past, conditions were warmer and wetter, and so that area was covered by very, very dense forest. And obviously, from the Oligocene onwards, as temperatures got lower, annual rainfall got lower, that forest died back and was replaced by, temperate forest in the lower lying areas and gymnosperms, so conifers, pine trees, in the higher elevation areas where conditions are even colder. Okay, so that was the plants. Now let's have a think about the birds. So during the Paleogene, we begin to see the first members of several living orders of birds appearing, particularly the owls, the ducks, the vultures, the hawks, the penguins. So the Cenozoic actually starts off as the time of the birds. So we typically have a very mammalian viewpoint. We are, let's face it, humans are mammals. We are, arguably the dominant species on the planet at the moment. So we kind of assume that when the dinosaurs died out, the mammals made their move. We're in charge from that point on. Done. that's not actually the case. So when the dinosaurs died out and we move into the Cenozoic, actually, for a period of time, it wasn't the mammals that were in charge, it was the birds. And the birds diversified very quickly in the early Cenozoic, and they became the dominant group. And we begin to see this, the number of different families within the larger bird group increased significantly during the Cenozoic, because on the whole they're taking over a lot of environments that were dominated by the flying reptiles and were dominated by the dinosaurs, especially on the ground. And so we begin to see in the early Cenozoic especially lots and lots of ground-dwelling birds make their move. So we see songbirds appearing during the Miocene, and we see by 5 to 10 million years ago, many of the present-day bird species were established. So if we were to travel back about, 7, 8 million years, we would be able to look around and we'd say, oh, I know what that bird is. So, so most of the modern bird species appeared about 10 million years ago. So birds continued to diversify into the Pleistocene, but since then their diversity has decreased slightly. And present-day birds vary significantly with regard to diet, habitat, adaptations, and size. So there's lots of variation in the bird population because, once again, we now have a very heterogeneous environment on Earth. There's lots of different areas, lots of varying temperatures, lots of different food sources, and so that means the birds have to have adapted to each individual environment. So just to give you a look at, I don't know why those didn't disappear, don't know what's happening there, just to give you a look at one of these, ground-dwelling birds that actually, made its appearance during the early to mid-Cenozoic. This is what's referred to as a terror bird, and we're going to discuss them more in a second. Maximum size of about 3 meters in height. And you can see, essentially, if you looked at it, you'd think, okay, I can kind of see a similar body design to something like a raptor. Think Jurassic Park and Velociraptor. And you think, okay, I can kind of see a similarity there. And that's because these ground-dwelling birds were taking over the niches that have been left by the dinosaurs. Now, what's going to happen eventually is they are going to be outcompeted by the mammals. But, as I said, from the start of the Cenozoic into about the middle Cenozoic, they are in charge. So, the skeletal structure differs little from very early birds, so like bird-dinosaur hybrids like Archaeopteryx. So that's because the adaptations required for flying, so things like relatively low-density bones, limits the possibility for variation when it comes down to it. So if we go back to the terror bird here, the basic design that we're seeing is remarkably similar to those very, very early dinosaur bird hybrids. I mean, obviously, you've got stuff like the beak, you've got the loss of the tail, you have changes in wing design, but on the whole, the basic breakdown is actually rather similar. So a couple of exceptions that we see making their appearance in the Cenozoic are the penguins. Of course, the penguins developed extremely robust wing bones and muscles and short legs. And we also see the appearance of the flightless birds, which developed more robust skeletons and smaller wings. So this is the group of birds that obviously includes the terror birds. So they couldn't fly. They were birds that essentially would have been more dinosaur-like. They lived exclusively on the ground, and they had to use their legs to move around. So they went and developed these extremely overdeveloped legs. Excuse me. So, following the extinction of dinosaurs, the major land-dwelling predators during the Paleocene and Eocene were the flightless birds, and among them were the Titanous birds, which are also referred to the terror birds, and they stood about 2.5 to 3 meters tall. They had very, very large heads and beaks, they had huge talons, and they had small vestigial wings. So, if you would come up against one of them, you would have been in trouble. So, they had relatively short legs for their size, which suggests they weren't actually that quick, but likely hunted large, slow mammals. So that would suggest maybe why they had to be so large. Because, if you're hunting a relatively large mammal, chances are that, relatively large mammal, you also have to be quite large. So that would explain why they had to get so big. So these birds and the species within that group are widespread in Europe, North America, and South America. And in South America, they actually remained important predators until about 2 million years ago. And we'll actually discuss what happens to them later on in this presentation. So other noticeable flightless birds include the elephant birds of Madagascar. So that's essentially like a 500 kilogram ostrich. So a 500 kilograms is about the same weight as a male grizzly bear. So, a very substantial bird. And you can see over here in this diagram, so each one of these squares represents 1 meter. So you can see an elephant bird would have stood approximately 3 meters high, and this is a modern day ostrich for comparison. So you can see it was an extremely large bird. And over here you can see the difference in egg size between an elephant bird egg here and an ostrich egg here. So these were clearly, extremely large animals. Another good example of a large flightless bird are the moas, and they existed in New Zealand and in several of the Polynesian islands. And they were 3 meter tall birds, similar to kiwis, although the beak shape was a little bit different. And so if we come down here, we can look in this diagram here. So here we have 4 different species of moas. You can see some of them were relatively small, and some of them were absolutely gargantuan. So, so these flightless birds became dominant because essentially the mammalian predators hadn't really, evolved yet. Large mammalian predators weren't on the rise at that point. So this means that, these flightless ground-dwelling birds pretty much had, once again, a clear playing field. It was, so they had, they moved first, they moved fastest, and they took over the environment. Now, as I said, over time, they're going to slowly be outcompeted by the mammals. So these birds are known from Pleistocene deposits, and interestingly, they went extinct after the first known arrival of humans. Wonder why? We can probably sort that one out for ourselves. So, as I mentioned, it's interesting to think that birds are just as successful as mammals, although we often don't think that way because we do have a very, mammal-centric way of thinking about life on Earth. So we've been going for another 20 minutes. This is a good place to pause the presentation. So once again, get up, have a walk around, go get a glass of water, and please come back in a few minutes. Okay, so now let's think about the mammals. So the mammals were present throughout the majority of the Mesozoic. However, they had a relatively low diversity, and they grew no larger than about 1 meter because they were so effectively outcompeted by the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs had complete control of the continental environment, and so the mammals didn't really stand a chance. So what we see is that mammals quickly diversified to fill the gaps left by the demise of the dinosaurs. I should actually put a slight caveat on that statement. I should say quickly diversified to fill gaps that were left by the birds, who were filling the gaps left by the dinosaurs. So mammal remains are common in Cenozoic age rocks. No shock there. Refer back to the earlier discussion about the pull of the recent. But when it comes to identifying mammals, often the teeth are the most useful when it comes to species identification and dating. That's because if you think of, let's think of a rat skeleton. A rat skeleton is on the whole relatively lightly built, and so yes, in Cenozoic rocks you will find bits of, rodent bone. However, on the whole, the skeleton itself will be relatively disarticulated. It will be broken up because the skeleton is so fragile. The teeth, on the other hand, are by far and away the most robust part, and so as long as you know what teeth belongs to which species, essentially you can use just the teeth to identify what species were present in an area. So mammal teeth vary from the front to the back, but they will also vary among the various orders and species. So of a special use are the chewing teeth, the molars, along with the premolars. So, if you run your tongue around inside your mouth, you'll feel your incisors at the front, you'll feel your canines, the pointy teeth, and then behind the canines you have these kind of 2 teeth that are they're slightly molar-like but also slightly pointy. Those are your premolars, and then behind your premolars you should have 3 molars. So the molars alone are often enough to identify a species, and each species will have slight variations in especially the molars and the premolars in a lot of cases. So, okay, the monotremes and the marsupial mammals. So all warm-blooded vertebrates with hair and mammary glands belong to the class Mammalia. So that means essentially there's 3 subgroups within the class Mammalia. We have the monotremes. That's the egg-laying mammals, that's the platypuses and the spiny anteaters. we have the marsupials, that's the pouched mammals, so that's kangaroos, possums and wombats. And we have the placental mammals, those include humans. So marsupials and placental mammals have true mammary glands which produce milk to feed the young. Interestingly though, the monotremes, this top group here, which includes, say, platypuses and spiny anteaters, secrete a milk-like substance that the young lick off the mother's hair. So they do have the prerequisite to be called mammals, but they have a slightly different method of actually getting the milk to the infants. So, it doesn't help also for the fact that when it comes to discussing monotremes, their fossil record is actually pretty terrible. So it's a bit difficult to, discuss that group in great detail. But nevertheless, despite the fact they are moderately different to marsupials and placental mammals, they have enough similarities to the other two groups to be considered a mammal. So the marsupials follow the same initial stages of embryonic development as a placental mammal. So, the egg gets fertilized, that fertilized egg will develop into a fetus, the fetus will be within an amniotic sac, and within the amniotic sac there will be a yolk sac which will act as the initial food supply for the fetus. However, that's where the similarities end. So once the yolk sac is exhausted, the young near embryonic marsupial has to move to and develop in the mother's pouch. So as you can see, it's a very different mechanism. So marsupials are common in isolated areas like Australia. So they were also common in South America for much of the Cenozoic. However, once the land connection between North America and South America was established, mammals migrated south, and they very quickly outcompeted the marsupials on the whole. The only large marsupial that thrived after this, what's referred to as the Great Exchange, are the opossums, which we're all familiar with. So what about the placental mammals? So in placental mammals, the amnion, so that's the wall of the amniote egg, fuses to the wall of the uterus. And this allows nutrients and oxygen to enter the amniote egg. In terms of the umbilical cord, well, that develops from the connecting stalk that holds the embryo in place. So if you ever cracked open a chicken egg, and you've got the egg white, you've got the yolk, and if you look in some cases, you'll see there's a kind of white, fuzzy, fibrous-looking material. Well, that's the connecting stalk that would hold the embryo in place if the egg had been fertilized. So in the case of placental mammals, that stalk will develop into the umbilical cord. And this method of reproduction has proven to be considerably more efficient than the marsupial method, essentially the pouched method. And this is demonstrated as over 90% of all mammals, living and prehistoric, are placentals. So in the vast majority of cases, being a placental mammal is an evolutionary advantage. So at present, there are approximately 18 living orders of placental mammals. At the start of the Paleocene, several orders were present. However, some of these were holdovers from the Mesozoic, and some were relatively short-lived groups. So you can see, like, you've got the oh cripes, I really hate pronouncing this name, the Multituba cablata. Horrendous pronunciation, I do apologise. You can see it's a group that makes it through the Mesozoic, they make it into the Cenozoic, but then that's it for them. And then you'll see there are some groups like the Insectivora, they make their appearance in the late Mesozoic, and they've made it all the way through to the present day. So these groups that make their appearance in the Mesozoic, or at least the late Mesozoic, are often referred to as the archaic mammals. And they include the marsupials, the insectivores, the monotremes, and the ones I'm not going to try and pronounce again because I'm going to embarrass myself. So they were joined in the Paleocene by several new orders, including the bats, the rodents, the rabbits, the primates, and the carnivores. So these early Paleocene groups weren't clearly defined from their ancestors, and differences between herbivores and carnivores were not strong. So obviously it takes time for species to diverge. And obviously, as you go back down the family tree, you'll see that the species look similar and similar and similar. So that's not really surprising that in the early Cenozoic, lots of species that were relatively, had only diverged recently from one another, had very strong similarities. That's kind of to be expected. So in the early Paleocene, all mammals were small. However, by the late Paleocene, we had the larger species beginning to appear. So giant mammals first put in an appearance in the Eocene. So it took a while for the mammals to start to get themselves established, and especially for the larger mammals to begin to make an appearance. So many mammal orders that appeared in the late Mesozoic to early Paleocene died out. So there was a bit of experimentation towards the end of the Mesozoic and early Paleocene, and once we get past this point, most of the orders that around the present day managed to survive. So in contrast to these earlier orders that on the whole mostly died out, of the orders that appeared in the Eocene onwards, only one of those orders has become extinct. So by the Eocene, most of the present day mammalian orders were present. So, if we were walking around in the Eocene, we would be able to see mammals that we would look at them and think, right, that's probably a such and such, for instance. Now, they wouldn't look like the modern examples, but chances are you would be able to work out what they were. It should be noted that the ancestors for horses, camels, elephants, whales and rhinos bore very little resemblance to the modern creatures, and you'll see that especially when we have a quick look at whale evolution in a few slides' time. So the warm, humid climate of the Paleocene and Eocene in North America cooled during the Oligocene, and this led to the extinction of the several archaic mammals, including organisms like giant rhinoceroses, the giant rhinoceros-like titanotheres. So the Oligocene marks a time of considerable change for the mammals, but it did allow the present-day orders to flourish. So if you remember, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum is over, and as we move from the Eocene into the Oligocene, we move into a period of stable but cooler global climates. And so what we see is a lot of mammals, adapting to those climates. We see mammals that can't adapt to those climates dying out. We see the mammals that can adapt to those climates beginning to establish themselves. So by the Miocene and the Pliocene, the majority of mammals would be recognizable to us. On closer inspection, though, we would notice that organisms like horses had 3 toes, we had cats with very large canines, and we had deer-like animals with forked horns on their noses, and we had very tall, very slender camels. So yes, we would have been able to say, oh, that's a such and such, but once you got close and actually really looked carefully, you would see there would be noticeable differences. Okay, so now let's think about the Paleogene and Neogene mammals. So if we remember, during the Carboniferous, the therapsids evolved from the finback reptiles. So once the therapsids subclades, the cynodonts, let's try that one again. One of the therapsid subclades, the cynodonts, would give rise to mammals, including us. So the point at which the cynodonts evolved into true mammals is a little fuzzy, but mammals had definitely appeared by the late Triassic. So throughout the Mesozoic, mammals did not diversify much because they were typically outcompeted by the dinosaurs. However, once the Cenozoic started, we really began to take off. So we now have about 5,000 species ranging from tiny shrews all the way up to the massive blue whale. We do, however, often forget about the smaller mammals like the rodents, the rabbits, the insectivores and the bats, of which approximately 70% have a weight of less than 1 kilogram. And once again, that's just the way humans tend to think. We think, well, we're relatively large mammals, therefore relatively large mammals are the only mammals that are important. Which, is rather stupid, to be honest. Okay, so let's take a couple of slides just to have a quick think about the small mammals, the insectivores, the rodents, the rabbits, and the bats. So these species obviously share a common ancestor from which they split during the late Cretaceous. They are, on the whole, relatively similar organisms with a relatively similar build. So with the exception of bats, which appeared in the Eocene, the other 3, the insectivores, the rodents, and the rabbits, their orders first appeared around the late Cretaceous and early Paleocene transition. So on the whole, they are actually archaic mammals. So they are all so small that they've adapted to numerous microhabitats, which are typically inaccessible to larger mammals, which in the case of bats is extremely true. So bats essentially have adapted to environments where the vast majority of mammals wouldn't go anywhere near. So, as the name suggests, insectivores, so organisms like shrews, moles, and hedgehogs, eat insects. So, fossils show that they have undergone surprisingly little change since the late Cretaceous. So, some suggesting that given the size of early mammals and the food sources available to them, it's been strongly suggested that an insectivore likely sits at the base of the great diversification of placental mammals. So think about it. If you're in the Mesozoic and you're a mammal, well, when it comes down to it, most niches are currently taken by the dinosaurs. So, they're in your way and you're not going to be able to outcompete them. Now, one of the few things you can do is you can be small and you can eat insects, because insects are plentiful. And so it's extremely likely that an insectivore was essentially the common ancestor for, there was the organism right at the base of this diversification of the placental mammals. I mean, it makes pretty reasonable sense. So the order Rodentia constitutes greater than 40% of all mammals. So it's a massive proportion of the mammal group, with most being very small. So after their first appearance in the Paleocene, they very rapidly diversified into a range of different habitats. And their success is down to their ability to eat almost anything and their very, very high rate of reproduction. And this means that essentially they can adapt to new environments very, very quickly. They can adapt to new food sources very, very quickly. So such high rates of reproduction especially permit for very rapid evolution. And this allows them to exploit new environments or consume new foods that they would not have been able to consume before. And hence the ability of some rats to eat poison and survive. So, New York City rats especially are very well known for their ability to eat poison that would kill other rats and live. And that's simply a example of microevolution. So, people put down a poison, it kills, let's say, 90% of the rats that eat it, but 10% of the rats, they eat it, and they're fine. And so those 10% go on to have young, and obviously that means that trait, that ability to eat that poison and not die, is then passed on to the next generation. Then they have, offspring, that trait gets passed on and on and on. Then they put a new poison out, that kills 90% of the rat population, but still 10% survive. So that 10% then has the immunity to the second poison, which then gets passed on down through the line. So over time, New York City rats especially have been building up a resistance to lots and lots of different poisons. And that's an example of the kinds of microevolution that the order Rodentia is extremely good at. So we get a few outliers of this group like beavers and capybaras from South America that are very, very large, with the latter, capybara, reaching up to 1 meter in length and weighing up to 45 kilograms. So a pretty substantial animal. Okay, so let's think about the rabbits. So the rabbits superficially resemble the rodents. Both of them are gnawing animals. They do, however, have several anatomical differences. The most obvious one is the development of very powerful hind limbs for speed. So, in the case of the rabbits, they obviously tend to consume their food in the open, and as such, if something comes to try and eat them, they need to be able to run very, very quickly. On the whole, rats tend to live in environments where they tend to move and they have a lot of cover, so they're less easy to spot. So, because rabbits, tend to exist in more open environments, that obviously means they have to have the capacity to run away very, very quickly. Hence, the very overdeveloped hind limbs. And if you've ever seen a rabbit running away, you will know that they are fast. So, modern rabbits typically weigh less than a few kilograms, but one Pliocene example from Spain weighed 12 kilograms. That's about the same as a 2-year-old child, give or take a little bit. In terms of the bats, well, the oldest bat has been found in Eocene age rocks from Wyoming, so it was the latecomer of the four. With the exception of the specialized forelimb for flying, bats actually differ relatively little from insectivores, especially shrews. So here you've got a picture of a bat over here. If you were just to take away this specially designed forelimb, the actual basic design of a bat is remarkably similar to other insectivores, especially shrews. So, unlike the pterosaurs and the birds, which use one or two very overdeveloped fingers to support the wing, bats use all 5 digits. So if we look at this picture here, you can see quite clearly. So here's the humerus, radius, ulna, and then we have the metacarpals, carpals, and then we have the phalanges here. And you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. All 5 digits are accounted for. And so, if you remember the pterosaurs would have a very overdeveloped 4th digit, which was stretched out along the front of the wing here. And in the case of this very stylized bird wing here, you can see that typically they have one vestigial finger here, and they'll often have 1 or 2 fingers at the end here. So a very different design. Okay, so we've been going for another 20 minutes, so let's pause, get up, have a walk around, go into a glass of water, and please come back in a few minutes. So we're going to take just a second to look at the primates. So the primates include 2 groups, the prosimians and the anthropoids. So in terms of the prosimians, that is a group that includes lemurs, and then we have the anthropoids. That's a group that includes monkeys, apes, and humans. And in terms of this particular group, there are some fossils from the late Cretaceous rocks, but we are a little uncertain about whether they are exactly primates. But we know for certain that primates had appeared by the Paleocene. It doesn't actually take that long for the very early primates to make their appearance. And from what we can tell, they were probably tree-climbing insectivores, a bit like, modern-day lemurs. So the different species evolved in approximately the following order. So in the Paleocene, we see the early primates, similar in shrews, making their appearance. So by the Eocene, we have larger primates, so we've got lemurs and tarsiers in Asia and North America. By the Oligocene, we have the primitive New and Old World monkeys appearing in South America and Africa, respectively. And by the Miocene, we have the hominoids, the group that contains apes and humans making their first appearance. So it's actually a relatively quick rise, and the hominoids are actually, in one form or another, are actually making their move by the Miocene. So the family itself has been around for a fair while. Okay, so now let's have a quick think about the carnivorous mammals. But before we do that, let's do the code word for this presentation. So the code word for this presentation is Oreo, as in the cookie, as in the chocolate cookies with the very super sweet sugary filling, which my wife absolutely loves, and I can't stand. Horrible things. But you will know why I'm thinking of Oreos later on when we come across an animal that has the word Oreo in its name. So, okay, so that was the code word, Oreo. So, okay, carnivorous mammals. So the order Carnivora is extremely diverse and it includes bears, weasels, seals, skunks, dogs, cats, huge range of animals. So the order contains those that are exclusively meat eaters, so that's cats, and of course those are termed carnivores. And those that have a somewhat more varied diet, so that's going to be animals like raccoons. They can eat both plants and meat, and of course they would be termed omnivores. So both types have a very specialized set of shearing teeth called carnassials, and they are designed for slicing meat. So if you have a dog and you've ever looked in their mouth, you'll know that behind their canines they have 2 teeth on the upper and lower jaws. Now they are what we would classify as our premolars, but in the case of dogs, they are very sharp, very pointy, very jagged teeth, and they're designed for slicing meat. And they're actually super well designed because they're actually designed to rub against each other, and they're actually self-sharpening teeth. It's like having self-sharpening knives. So, they're brilliantly designed for essentially biting meat and cutting through it. So the preferred method for catching food varies widely, with some dependent on speed and agility, so think of an animal like a cheetah. Some prefer brute force to essentially dig out their prey, think of something like a badger. Others use stealth to stalk their prey, think of something like a house cat, while others are just straight ambush predators, so think of something like a cougar. So the way that the carnivorous mammals hunt varies significantly, and that's not really surprising because it's a very big group. So in terms of carnivores, we noted that they typically have a larger brain-to-body size when compared to herbivores, and that's a reflection of the need for improved skills, particularly when it comes to things like spatial reasoning. So especially, animals like wolves that typically hunt in packs, you need to, number one, you need to be able to try and work out, well, where's the animal going to go that we're hunting. You then also need to be able to work out where your other pack members should go to actually trap whatever you're trying to catch. So, you need to obviously be able to think your way around this problem. And another reason, of course, as to why carnivores can support large brains is that they have a very energy-rich diet. So, meat is, pretty much about as energy-rich a food as you can possibly get. So they have, lots and lots of energy, which can be, given over to a large brain. So carnivorous mammal fossils are nowhere near as common as those of other mammals for two reasons. The first one is that carnivores only constitute approximately 5% of the population of warm-blooded animals. That's because a single warm-blooded predator requires a very, very large prey population. Because they require so much energy, they need lots and lots of animals to eat. So this means that obviously you can't have a particularly large proportion of your warm-blooded population being made up of predators, otherwise there wouldn't be enough prey. The other reason is that the vast majority of carnivores are solitary organisms. They'll just go off by themselves, they're quite happy that way, and of course that means that the chances of them being successfully fossilized when they live this very solitary existence is a lot lower. Think about it, it's a lot easier to collect fossils if you have a whole herd of bison, for instance. There's a good chance that there could be some event that would kill multiple bison at the same time, and maybe one of those or two of those bison will successfully fossilize. In contrast, if you just have a lone animal by itself, the chances of it being successfully fossilized are significantly reduced. However, we do have enough material to piece together the evolutionary history with a pretty high degree of confidence. So the order Carnivora began to diversify in the Paleocene, and it produced two groups, the creodonts and the mysids. So both were short-limbed, suggesting they were not fast, but both had well-developed canines, and they had the all-important carnosals. So by the Miocene, approximately 8 million years ago, the creodonts had become extinct, with the mysids evolving to produce the present-day carnivorous mammals. So we see hyena-like dogs first appearing in the Middle Miocene, and interestingly, hyenas, and I didn't know this until I actually read this in the textbook, hyenas aren't actually dogs, they're actually more closely related to cats, which caught me rather off by surprise. However, hyenas and early dogs are an excellent example of convergent evolution. The very similar body designs appearing because they live in relatively similar environments, and as such it's simply the best body design for that environment. In terms of cats, cats first make their appearance in the Oligocene, but by the Miocene some cats had developed extremely large canines, think saber-toothed cats, which obviously are well known from Pleistocene deposits. We see seals, sea lions and walruses have developed streamlined bodies with a layer of blubber and paddle-like limbs that are good for swimming. And we see that seals and sea lions have what are referred to as single cusped teeth designed for eating fish. In contrast, walruses have very flat teeth designed for crushing shells. So we see that, by the middle Cenozoic, we have the seals, the sea lions, and the walruses kind of, beginning to appear. We see their body design changing to adapt to water, and we can also see their tooth design changing to adapt to their particular food sources. So we see seals and sea lions have teeth that begin to adapt for eating fish, and we have walruses that begin to adapt their teeth for essentially crushing shells. Interestingly, by going back through their evolutionary tree, it becomes clear that they are actually most closely related to bears. Okay, so now we're moving on to the hoofed animals, otherwise known as the ungulates. So the ungulate is an informal term referring to several groups of extinct and existing hoofed animals. So essentially there's the order Artiodactyla, that includes camels, or there's the order Perissodactyla, that includes horses. So Artiodactyla, or even-toed hoofed mammals, are the most numerous, with about 170 living species, including cattle, goats, sheep, swine, antelope, deer, giraffes, hippopotami, camels, to name but a few. And so you can see the group Artiodactyla over here. You can see that the weight is borne by either the, now I need to do a quick bit of thinking, it's either borne by the third or fourth toe in the case of camels, or in the case of pigs, the second, third, fourth and fifth toe. So essentially they have either 2 or 4 toes. The Perissodactyla, on the other hand, are referred to as the odd-toed hoofed mammals, and there are only 16 existing species. That includes horses, rhinoceroses and tapirs. However, during the early Cenozoic, the Perissodactyls were actually more common than the Artiodactyls. Just go back for a second. So you can see here's a modern horse. You can see they have a single toe, so essentially the weight is borne by the third toe. The first, second, fourth and fifth toes are vestigial, they've gone. In the case of a rhinoceros, you can see the weight is borne by the second, third and fourth toe. The first and fifth toe are once again vestigial and they've been lost. So the distribution of weight on the foot varies between the two groups. So as I was saying, Artiodactyls, they have 2 or 4 toes with the weight focused on the third and fourth toes. 4-toed varieties have either lost the first toe or it is vestigial. 2-toed varieties have lost the first, second and fifth toes, or they are vestigial. Typically they're just gone. The group Perissodactyla have 1 or 3 toes. The weight is borne primarily on the third toe, with the 3-toed varieties missing the first and fifth toe, and the 1-toed varieties missing the first, second, fourth and fifth toes. So the missing toes are typically vestigial, and sometimes horses can actually be born with 3 toes in some circumstances. So a significant number of hoofed animals use speed to escape predators. And so, think of horses, think of deer, think of antelope, those kinds of animals. And obviously, if you want to use speed to run away, it's obviously very, very helpful if you have super long legs. And this has actually been achieved in a rather interesting way. So if we look at this skeleton over here, so let's look at the legs here. So let's look at the hind legs. So here's the femur. This would be the radius and the ulna. And if you think about it, these bones will have been extended to their maximum possible length. Now there's a bit of a problem. If you're running away really, really quickly and you have to make a very, very fast turn, well, imagine if one of these bones is very, very long and very, very slender. As you make that fast turn, the bone is obviously going to start to flex, and if it's too long, it's going to snap. So there's a maximum possible length that these bones can reach before they become too weak. So the problem becomes for these animals that want to run away using speed, they need to try and think of a different way to make their legs longer. And so what they did is they actually went and increased the bones of the palm and the sole. So if you look at your arm, you've got the humerus at the top, the radius and ulna make up your lower arm, and then imagine the bones in your palm are the same length as the bones in your lower arm. And that's exactly what these animals that use speed have managed to do. They've essentially made their palm bones, or the bones of the soles of their feet, much, much longer. And that's allowed them to essentially achieve a much longer stride. And therefore it makes them more efficient when it comes to running away from predators. That's a very interesting design feature that these animals have managed to achieve. So these fast runners also tend to have fewer bones in their feet when they're compared to their ancestors, and this is simply a result of the decreased number of toes. So those that are not built for speed tend to favour darting movements. So that's quick bursts of speed in order to get under cover or enter a burrow. Think of something like a rabbit. So rabbits, a rabbit isn't designed for, a long run. An antelope an antelope has the capacity to run for a very, very long period of time if it needs to. Something like a rabbit is designed for a really, really fast, short run to get under cover. From that point on, if you try and have a rabbit run for a long time, it'll actually start to tire out relatively quickly. And then, of course, there are some of the mammals have decided to go for size. And let's face it, if you want to mess with a rhinoceros or a hippo or a camel, then you could get yourself in trouble very, very quickly. So those animals have feet that are obviously designed to take the additional weight of being so large. And we obviously also see the bones of the limbs of those animals are also particularly oversized. So in the case of rhinos, they have very, very big, broad feet with very, very big, heavy bones. In the case of camels actually took a slightly different approach. If we just go back for a second, you'll notice how the toes here of the camel are actually spread slightly out. That's designed to make the size of the foot slightly broader. And so that means the weight of the camel is spread out over a larger surface area, and that's obviously particularly effective if you're moving through an environment that has loose, sandy soil underfoot, like a desert. So both groups are herbivores, so that's the Artiodactyla and the Perissodactyla, and they have premolars and molars adapted to chewing vegetation. So once again, rub your tongue around the inside of your mouth, you'll feel the two premolars behind your canines, and you'll feel that in the case of ours, they're kind of a hybrid between a molar and a canine. They're kind of slightly pointy, but also kind of slightly flat. In the case of the Artiodactyla and the Perissodactyla, these premolars have become flattened, so essentially they look just like a regular molar. And that's a trend called molarization. And that's something you see with animals that are, essentially plant-based. They eat plants, and they need to essentially grind up as many molds as possible to grind up the food to make sure they get maximum possible nutrient extraction from that food. So the ungulates are split into two groups based on their eating habits. There are browsers and there are grazers. So the browsers eat leaves, twigs and shoots off trees and shrubs, whilst the grazers eat grass. So the thing about grazers is if you're eating grass, well, when you're obviously biting the grass, you're not only taking the grass up, but chances are you're pulling up some of the root in some cases, and you're also pulling up the soil. Now, soil typically consists of four things: air, water, undecomposed organic material, and most importantly, little pieces of rock. Silt, clay, and sand-sized particles. And obviously these little pieces of rock are abrasive. So if grazers had a tooth like a modern-day human, well, what would happen? So a human tooth, as you can see here, it's what's referred to as a low-crown tooth, and it has protective enamel on the top, the dentine below, and underneath there, of course, you have the nerve. Now, if you eat large quantities of food that contains lots of silt and sand, the enamel is going to very quickly wear down, which will expose the dentine, and then obviously the nerve will get exposed, and then you will be in extreme pain. You will not be able to eat, and unfortunately that will be the end of you. So what's happened is, over time, throughout the Cenozoic, the grazers have developed what's referred to as the high-crowned tooth. So look at the difference. They've essentially added all this additional height to the tooth. So by doing that, what they've done, well, the first thing they've done is they've added this layer of cement that typically is only on the bottom of low-crown teeth. They've taken that layer of cement all the way around. So first of all, they have an additional hard layer. That's the first thing that needs to be breached. So then, even if the cement wears down, underneath it you have the enamel. That's another hard layer that helps to protect the interior of the tooth. So that needs to be worn down as well. Then once the enamel's gone, they have to wear down all of this material here before they get anywhere near the nerve. And so that means these teeth are extremely abrasion resistant. And so obviously it makes a lot of sense for grazers to have that particular tooth design. It means they're going to be able to live for longer. Okay, so let's think of the group Artiodactyla. So the earliest arthrodactyls appeared in the early Eocene, and the oldest example is an organism called Diatodexis, and that was around 50 centimeters long. And they quickly diversified, with many occurring in North America at some point. Aha! The Oreo. The Oreodonts were actually a very interesting animal. They were kind of like a hybrid between a pig and a sheep, and they were common until their extinction in the Miocene. And they diversified throughout the Oligocene and the Miocene, with habitats ranging from grassland to semi-aquatic, like Oreodonts, that were kind of hippo-like. And they were actually a super-duper successful group. They were doing really, really well. And then all of a sudden, they went extinct. And the actual reason for the extinction of the Oreodonts is a bit of a mystery. We don't really know what happened to them. They looked as if they were doing fine, and then all of a sudden, one day, something clearly went very seriously wrong. So, Oreodonts are one of these interesting examples of an organism in evolution where we stare at it and we go, we don't really know what caused a particular species to disappear. So, yeah, an interesting one there. So, in terms of other arthrodactyls, camels were common in North America from the Eocene. Initially, they had a 4-toed foot, but this changed to a 2-toed foot by the Oligocene. Excuse me. So, trends in camel evolution during the Oligocene included an increase in body size, the aforementioned reduction in the number of toes, and the fusing of the 2 toes together, a reduction in the number of front teeth, and a shift to high crown teeth and molarization. So, they're shifting to more of a grazing setup. So, North American camels ranged from giraffe-like camels with long necks, you had gazelle-like camels with very long legs, and you had giant camels which stood about 3.5 meters at the shoulder, so really very substantial animals. Now, most camel evolution actually took place in North America. However, in the Pliocene, they migrated into Asia and South America, and the North American camels actually died out in the Pleistocene, so during the last ice age. Another group of interest are the bovines, and so that includes cattle, bison, sheep, goats, antelope, and impala. And they don't appear until the Miocene, and they only begin to diversify in the Pliocene. So actually, they're quite latecomers on the North American continents. They are now dominantly found in Africa and Asia, although North America does have some. For instance, we have bighorn sheep and mountain goats. However, the most prominent were the bison, the pronghorn, and the Oreodonts, which migrated in vast herds. So many arthrodactyls are ruminants, so they're cud-chewing animals, and they probably would have had, the ones that do exist now, have 3 or 4 stomachs, and this allows the vegetation to be digested multiple times, leading to maximum nutrient extraction. And this is one of the key reasons why the arthrodactyls appear to have become dominant over the perissodactyls. They seem to have a slightly better setup for getting the maximum amount of goodness out of the plant vegetation that they eat. So here is the group Arthrodactyla. So you can see down here at the bottom we have Diatodexis, and you can see it diversify into several different groups. We've got the deer, the musk deer, the bovines, giraffes, camels, etc., all coming off. And then we have several groups that didn't make it all the way to the end, like the Oreodonts, as I said, that disappeared for as yet rather uncertain reasons. And you can see here we have the ruminants. So these are, of course, the cud-chewing animals. So these are mostly going to eat grass, so they're going to be grazers, they're going to have high crown teeth. And then you have animals like the pigs. Obviously, in terms of the pigs are tend more towards actually being omnivores. They can eat both, meat and vegetable and vegetation. And even the hippos have a surprisingly varied diet. Okay, so we've been going for another 20 minutes, so let's pause here. So once again, get up, have a walk around, and go and get yourself a glass of water, please. Okay, so now let's move on to the perissodactyls. So the common ancestor for the perissodactyls appeared in the Paleocene, and diversification continued through the Eocene, with the major groups like the horses, rhinos, tapirs, the calicotheres, and the titanotheres becoming further distinct and established. So the point of greatest diversity in the group was achieved during the Oligocene, and there's been a very strong decline from that point onwards. And arguably the most diverse group of the perissodactyls are the horses. So I know this is a particularly, it's not a great diagram, but it does show you the family tree for the perissodactyls. You can see up here only the horses, the tapirs, and the rhinoceroses make it to the present day. You can see that a lot of the other groups, so we've got the Titanotheres here, down here. We've got the Chalicotheres down here, and several other smaller groups don't make it to the present day. So horses are especially common in North America, where a significant portion of their evolution took place. And their high abundance means that their fossil record is extremely good. And the earliest member is a 20 to 30 centimeter high species called Hyracotherium, which weighed about 20 kilograms, give or take a little bit. So Hyracotherium was a forest-dwelling animal. It had a four-toed forefoot and a three-toed hindfoot, so it had a bit of a difference there, with each toe possessing its own small hoof. So if we come down here to Hyracotherium, you can see that each one of these toes, they're separated. They each had their own small hoof. You had a four-toed foot at the front and a three-toed foot at the rear. So it doesn't sound particularly horse-like. However, the very good fossil horse record that exists conclusively shows that they are related to modern horses. So, although not exactly, particularly horse-like, we can actually, go back through the record and we can say, yes, definitively, they are the ancestor for the horses. So, in the late Eocene to early Oligocene, horses split into two distinct groups. These are the three-toed browsing horses, which are all now extinct. And then we have the three-toed grazing horses, which evolved into the one-toed horse that we see now. So if we look at the evolution of the horses, we have obviously Hyracotherium down here. And you can see as we're going through the Oligocene, the Miocene, so we've got three toes. By the time we're up here into the Pliocene and Pleistocene, we can see that the second and fourth toe have become vestigial. And by the Pliocene, they've completely disappeared. And by the Pleistocene, we have essentially the modern horse that we have now, which bears its weight on just one single toe, which essentially is the third toe of the forelimb and the hind limb. So the development of cement-covered, abrasion-resistant high-crowned teeth by horses coincides with the spread of grasses during the Miocene. So, if you remember, during the Paleocene and the Eocene, we obviously had a warm, humid climate. That meant lots of forest. So if you are a browsing horse, then that means there's lots of trees, lots of bushes, which you can nip, buds off and that kind of thing, eat leaves off, and so you can obviously, there's plenty of food for you. Now, as we move in to the Oligocene and the Miocene in particular, we see these forests begin to die back. So they're going away, and they're being replaced by grassland. And so obviously, if you are a browsing horse, you are in trouble. If you are a grazing horse, great, because there's more grass for you to eat. So that appears to be why the browsing horses became extinct. It would just simply seem the retreat of these large forests that were established during the earlier portion of the Cenozoic, and their loss means that, unfortunately, they couldn't make it to the present day. So horses developed an escape strategy based on speed, and that's reflected by the steady increase in the length and the shift to a single-toed foot. So as we discussed, the palm and sole bones of the forelimb and hind limb respectively steadily increased, allowing for a longer stride length, and we also saw a shift to a single-toed foot. So if we look at Merychippus, it's a good example of a transitional grazing horse with a high-crowned teeth and a three-toed foot, although two of the three toes are near vestigial. So here it is here, you can see, looks very horse-like, but as you can see when you look at the foot design, yes, the majority of the weight is borne by the third toe, and the second and the fourth toes are vestigial, but they're still there. And you can see it's just a short step there towards a lot, horses that appear to be, very modern in their design. The other surviving, I should also point out, by the way, that when we look at these horses, look at the size of them over time. Horses have been getting steadily larger and larger, and that's a reflection of the type of environment in which they're living. So if we go back for a second, we have the browsing horses dominating during the Eocene and the Oligocene, where we had plenty of forest around. If you've got forests, you've got lots of trees. Trees are obstructions. They're going to get in your way if you're trying to run away from a predator. So if you're a big horse, if you've seen a modern horse, you will know they are not small animals. If you're a big horse, then trying to get between those trees to get away from whatever is trying to eat you is very, very difficult. So in that situation, being a small horse is definitely advantageous. Now, once the forest begins to die back, on the other hand, you are relying on your speed to get away from predators that are trying to eat you. So obviously you need longer legs. If you have longer legs, essentially you're going to have a bigger body, bigger muscles, you can run faster. And that means the body size begins to increase. So that's why we have this shift from the browsing horses to the grazing horses, because the conditions just favour the grazing horses. And we also see a shift in the body size. Relatively small horses down here, considerably larger horses up here. So the other surviving group of the perissodactyls are the rhinoceroses and the tapirs, and they increased in size from their early Cenozoic ancestors. And they increased in size and diversity throughout the Eocene and the Oligocene, but they have steadily declined from that point on. By the way, there's a picture of a tapir behind here in case you're wondering what one looked like. So most evolution occurred in the Old World, but North American examples were present until the Pleistocene. So at 5 meters high and 13 to 14 tons in weight, the largest land mammal to ever have existed was actually a hornless rhinoceros. And you can actually see it right here. Very, very large animal there. Just to be clear, for comparison, this is a human with a height of about 1.7, 1.8 meters. And if you compare it to, more common animals, for instance, if we, black rhino is here in yellow, we have an Indian rhino here in blue, and we have a white rhinoceros here in this kind of, peachy red color. And you can see, compared to modern rhinos, this is an absolute monster. So the two remaining now extinct groups of the perissodactyls are the Chlicothes and the Titanotheres, and both steadily increased in size throughout the Cenozoic. So the Titanotheres have a very good fossil record, but existed only in the Eocene, making them the shortest lived member of the family. And they evolved to a maximum height of about 2.5 meters, with their nose horn becoming more pronounced as evolution persisted. So we have a picture of some Titanotheres back here. They were very rhinoceros-like in their appearance. They typically had a double horn on the nose, and it would seem they were grazing animals. But they only existed in the Eocene, and they very quickly became extinct. Why is uncertain. They were probably outcompeted by other organisms. So then we have the Chlicothes, and they have a relatively sparse fossil record, and that suggests they were somewhat solitary creatures, so they weren't moving in herds. So the largest members reached a size equivalent to a very large horse. And interestingly, when we look at this picture down here, you'll see that the front limbs actually have claws rather than hooves. And the adaptation probably allowed them to pull down branches and offer some protection against predators. So the Chlicothes were probably walked on their knuckles when it came to their forelimbs. And obviously, as I say, these hooked claws on the front, they could pull down branches to eat, and they could obviously use them to some degree for defense. And they became extinct around 700,000 years ago during the Pleistocene. So unfortunately, the last ice age did for them. And you can see they had these clawed forelimbs, and they would have walked along on the knuckles. Okay, so now let's look at some other land-dwelling mammals. Let's have a quick look at the elephants. So elephants are amongst the largest land mammals ever. So the largest example was a 12-ton and 4.2-meter high animal approaching the size of the hornless rhinoceros that we saw a couple of slides ago. And it would have been essentially around the same kind of size as a woolly mammoth. So along with their size, the other distinguishing feature for elephants is obviously their long snout, or proboscis, or trunk, depending on what term you prefer to use. So the earliest member of the order was a 100 to 200 kilogram example called Mertherium, and it first appeared in the Eocene. And it has few direct characteristics with elephants and was likely aquatic or semi-aquatic. So if we just jump to the next page. So here's Mertherium down here, and you can see doesn't look particularly elephant-like. But we know we have a reasonable fossil record for the elephants, and so we know with relative certainty this is the animal at the base of the tree. So the proboscis first appeared with the Paleomastodon at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. So here's the Paleomastodon here, and you can see the first stages of the development of the proboscis trunk, whatever term you want to use for it. So by the Oligocene, the order showed a trend towards larger sizes, long proboscises, large tusks. So the tusks are actually enlarged in sizes. They are in fact teeth. So most elephants develop tusks in the upper jaw only, but a few had them in both jaws. So if we look over here, we have what's referred to as the shovel-tusked mastodon, and you can see it has tusks on the upper jaw and on the lower jaw down here. So mastodons evolved in Africa, but spread into the northern continents from the middle Miocene to Pleistocene, with one species actually making it all the way to South America. So the mastodons are over here. So that's one branch. Mammoths diverged from elephants in the late Miocene. So here are the mammoths over here. Excuse me. Late Miocene to Pliocene, sorry. And they first appeared in North Africa, then they moved into Europe, Asia, and North America from there. The mammoths died out at the end of the last ice age. However, the last continental populations persisted until only 10,000 years ago in Siberia. So, so whilst human beings were working, on pyramids and other structures in ancient Egypt, there were still mammoths walking around in Siberia. And even more interestingly, we've actually found that there were isolated populations on islands that persisted until 3,750 years ago on St. Paul's Island in Alaska, and 1,650 years ago, on Wrangel Island in Russia. And both of these islands are in the Bering Sea. And the populations actually appear to have been pretty well off. Conditions appear to be rather good for them, so they should have existed through to the present day. But unfortunately, the population size was too small. And when you have a population size that's too small, obviously that ends up with significant amounts of interbreeding, and when you have significant amounts of interbreeding, that leads to essentially weakening of the genetic material of that particular group. And unfortunately, it would seem that they died out because essentially they became genetically weaker and weaker and weaker. So now let's think about the giant aquatic mammals, the whales. So we should never forget that the largest animal ever is actually alive today. So at a maximum 30 meters long and 130 tons in weight, only 99% of all dinosaurs would have had a very serious inferiority complex. So the only modern organism to come close are trees, such as the giant redwood. So just need to be clear, there were some dinosaurs that were longer. So, think of a dinosaur like a Diplodocus, for instance. That would have had a length in excess of 30 meters, so it would have been longer. However, because the weight of the Diplodocus wasn't supported by water, it couldn't weigh as much. Now, because of whales living in water, the water helps to support some of the weight, and as such, whales can become extraordinarily heavy. Hence the fact they weigh about 130 tons when fully grown. So, just bear that in mind. So, for comparison, compared to a whale, the largest redwood ever weighed about 20,000 tons, and most of them are about 25 tons. So most redwood trees, some of them could achieve a similar size and weight to a blue whale. However, in this case, we're only really interested in mammals, so we don't really care about trees that much. So of the several types of aquatic or semi-aquatic mammals, only sea cows and whales are so adapted to the marine environment they can't survive on land. So think of other marine animals, think of seals, think of walruses. They can come in and out of the water as they see fit. So the ancestor species for whales has been identified in Eocene-aged rocks from Southeast Asia, and this dog-sized organism appears to have been closely related to the artiodactyl, so the even-toed hoofed mammals. So as evolution progressed, the following changes occurred. I should point out, by the way, that when we look at the whales, it seems there was a branching off, and one group went towards the artiodactyls, and especially towards the hippopotamuses, and another group broke off down here and went towards the animals that would become modern-day whales. So as evolution progressed, we see the following changes. Body size increases, the forelimbs become more paddle-like, the hind limbs shrink, becoming vestigial, and eventually they're nearly completely gone now. The nostrils become, essentially they migrate towards the top of the head, which obviously makes a lot of sense if you're living in the water. If you have nostrils on the end of your nose, you obviously have to put your entire nose out of the water to breathe. If you have the nostril on top of your head, on the other hand, you just need to poke your back out of the water. And we see the tail develops a horizontal fluke for propulsion. So whale evolution was relatively rapid and occurred mostly over the 20 million years of the Eocene. And this is quite interesting. So think about it this way: in the Mesozoic, you had the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, the mosasaurs, and they were the apex predators during that time period in the oceans. Now, at the end of the Mesozoic, they're gone. So that means essentially in the oceans there is no large apex predator. And so when these early whales make their move into that environment, once again, the field is clear. And so they just go for it, and they begin to evolve very, very quickly to take advantage of this situation. So in the space of approximately 10 million years, we went from Amblicitus, which is this animal up here, which had the capacity to move on land and in water, to Basilosaurus, which is this animal down here, which had only tiny vestigial hind limbs, forelimbs that had been developed for flippers, and forelimbs that had developed into flippers, and obviously it had no capacity to live essentially outside water. However, Basilosaurus still had the same teeth as its ancestor, and its nostrils were on its snout. So evolution wasn't complete at that point. So by the Oligocene, both current whale groups had evolved. We have the filter-feeding baleen whales, so that includes the blue whales, and we have the toothed whales, that includes organisms like killer whales and dolphins. Now, when I was looking at the previous diagram, I actually realized I just made a small mistake in terms of the order, but we're going to continue anyway. So this kind of shows you an approximate evolution for the whales. So obviously we start off with Amblicitus up here, and you can see essentially it looks, has the kind of body where you would think, man, that could survive on land or, in water. It clearly has webbed forelimbs and hind limbs, so for propulsion through water. But you can see it has a very long nose, has its nostril on the front there, and we believe it actually still had fur. So we don't believe it had, any kind of layer of blubber, for instance, allowing it to stay in the water, or at least cold water, for prolonged periods of time. So Amblicitus appears to have evolved into another organism called Rhodocetus. And you can see, once again, very similar design. We can see elongated snout, teeth, nostrils still on the nose. We can see we have the forelimbs and hind limbs are still webbed. But we can see, a bit more of a sleek body design. We can see the body design starting to get a little bit more elongated and probably a little bit better designed for living in water. Now, if we just come back up here, so this is Rhodocetus up here. Now, I've actually got Gyrodon as the next one, but in fact, according to this diagram, Gyrodon actually falls after the Basilosaurus. So anyway, whichever way we do it, by the time we get to the Basilosaurus, you can see we have a very elongate body. You can see the forelimbs have turned into, what we described as proper fins. The hind limbs are pretty much vestigial, they're nearly completely gone, and the tail has developed a horizontal fluke for propulsion through the water. Now, in the case of Gyrodon, what you get is essentially the same basic body design as Basilosaurus, horizontal fluke, elongate body, but in the case of Gyrodon, we can see the nostrils have begun to migrate towards the top of the head. And this is obviously a very significant evolutionary advantage. So anyway, whichever way you look at it, this essentially is the basic family tree. So we go from very simple organisms like Ambulocetus to intermediate organisms like Rhodocetus, down to Basilosaurus and Gyrodon down here, and then finally we take the final step to the baleen whales and the toothed whales. Okay, so time for a quick break. So pause the presentation, get up, have a walk around, and go and get a drink of water, please. Okay, so now let's think about the Pleistocene. Let's think about the Ice Age. So by the Pleistocene, the majority of the archaic mammals had been picked off, and we were mostly left with species that we would be able to easily identify. However, the distribution of these species was considerably different. So for instance, there were rhinos, elephants, and camels living in North America. There were still a few interesting species hanging around. We had the Chalicotheres, and we had the heavily armoured Glyptodonts. So you think of a giant armadillo with a spiky clubbed tail. A pretty spectacular creature. While we had the giant Moas birds and elephant birds that were still present in New Zealand and Madagascar, respectively. So, there were still some very interesting animals around. So not everything looked exactly like it did now. So, okay, now let's think about the Ice Age. So it seems strange that during a period of global cooling, when the environment was becoming more challenging, the trend for mammalian evolution was actually bigger is better. So there's a selection of large, so essentially below we have a selection of large mammals by continent. So for instance, in North America we had mastodons, mammoths, giant bisons, giant sloths, giant camels, and 2-meter long beavers. In South America, we had giant sloths and the Glyptodonts. In Europe, we had the elephants, cave bears, giant deer, which is referred to as Irish elk. There were rhinos and mammoths. In Asia, there were elephants, cave bears, giant deer, and mammoths. In Australia, there were 3-meter tall kangaroos and wombats the size of rhinos. So it seems a bit weird. It seems a bit counterintuitive. When times are harder, often the smart thing to do is to become smaller. You need less food. It makes it easier for you to survive. You can hide more easily. You can, burrow into the ground, which will keep you nice and warm. So the question is why in these environments did animals start to get larger rather than smaller? So to be clear, smaller mammals did exist and they were much more numerous, just like they are now. Excuse me. So the pull towards larger bodies may well have been driven by cooler conditions. So it actually can be related back to the surface area to volume ratio. So as this cube here gets larger, the volume is increasing, but the surface area is not increasing at the same rate as the volume. So for instance, you can see that we have a bit of a difference here. So in this case, for this cube here, the surface area to volume ratio is 6 to 1. By this one, 3 to 1. By this one, 2 to 1. So we can see the surface area isn't keeping pace with the volume. So this means that the larger your animal gets, comparatively speaking, the smaller the surface area it has. And therefore, if you have a small surface area, that's less surface area through which you can lose heat. And so that means, yes, you have to eat more because you're larger, but it means you're going to lose less of that energy due to heat loss. And so if you're in cold conditions, being able to retain that energy, through reducing heat loss is going to be extremely important. So that would help to explain why having a larger body becomes, super helpful during the Pleistocene. Obviously, as well, having a larger body also helps when it comes to the constant arms race between predator and prey. if you're a mammoth, pretty much no one is going to mess with you because you are pretty scary looking. So, given how recently the rocks and sediments were deposited, there has been little time for Pleistocene deposits to be disturbed, and this means that fossils from this epoch are relatively common. So to give you an idea, where I grew up in a little village just west of Oxford, you could go around with a shovel, dig around in your back garden, and you could find pieces of mammoth bone, just in the soil. So the best known examples include mammoths and bison that have been frozen and mummified within permafrost in Siberia and Alaska. This is the great thing. Because this event happened so recently, we actually have examples of organisms that have remained frozen since the end of the Pleistocene. And so we actually have specimens that we can, complete specimens that we can look at. So the permafrost is a layer of constantly frozen soil just below the ground surface. And, in the past, it wasn't uncommon in these areas when times were hard that people would actually go out and they would try and find these carcasses preserved in the permafrost and use them as a source of meat. So, other important sources of Pleistocene fossils are areas like the La Brea tar pits and the boggy areas of Florida. So tar is a natural form of asphalt that seeps to the surface, and animals will become stuck in the tar, and essentially they become what's called mired in it, and they can't escape. Now the tar will naturally gather in topographic lows. And so what happens is on top of this, essentially this layer of tar, typically a very thin layer of water will build up. And so what happens is, an animal comes along, it decides, I really want a drink of water. It walks out into what it believes is a body of water, but in reality it is, of course, the tar. And of course it gets stuck in the tar and it can't escape because obviously the tar is very, very heavy and very, very sticky. And so obviously the animal gets trapped there. And obviously it's eventually going to starve to death. Now, then what happens is carnivores walk past, think wolves, saber-toothed cats, other animals like vultures. They're suddenly walking or flying past and they think, great, easy meal. And so they then go into the water in the hope of eating whatever is there. And of course, they become stuck in the tar as well. And then another wolf walks past and thinks, great, 2 easy meals. And so it walks into the tar thinking it's about to have an easy meal, and of course, it gets stuck. And so, by far and away, the most common animal in the La Brea tar pits are actually wolves that have walked into the tar to try and eat other animals that have become stuck in it. So, in total, there are about 230 different vertebrates that have been identified from the La Brea tar pits, and one of them is actually a 20 to 30-year-old human female who fell in approximately 9,000 years ago. So, the La Brea tar pits are interesting. Now, to be clear, the muscle and the skin of the animals will decompose in the tar; it will fall off, but the bones themselves are pristine. They're exactly as they were. So once again, the La Brea tar pits offers us a window where we have near perfectly preserved fossils. In the case of Florida, Florida presents good conditions for preservation, with animals becoming trapped in waterlogged areas. And these waterlogged areas tend to have relatively limited amounts of oxygen in the water, and so this helps to slow down the rate of decomposition. And so you can find animals within these boggy areas of Florida that essentially have been preserved due to the low oxygen concentrations of the water in that area. And so just to show you some examples here, so here we have examples of frozen organisms. Here we have a frozen mammoth from Siberia and a frozen bison. I think this one was from Alaska. And in the case of the La Brea tar pits, you can see here we have water beetles. Now that helps us to know that there was a layer of water above the layer of tar. And you can see this essentially is a sequence of, a collection of bones. You can see a whole mass of bones here. And in this case, you can actually see we have the skull of some kind of saber-toothed cat. You can see the 2 front teeth there. So when it comes to the Pleistocene mammals especially, we actually have a pretty good fossil record. So now we're going to think about the intercontinental migration between North and South America, or more importantly, also between North America and Asia. So the migration of species between continents accounts for many of the similarities of North American, Asian, and European fauna during the Cenozoic. So obviously, during the last ice age, global sea levels were lower, and so you could literally walk from Russia to Alaska. There was no Bering Sea there. So that obviously made it super easy for animals to walk from one continent to another. So the Bering Strait, as I say, between Asia and North America, essentially formed a land bridge during the glacial episodes, allowing for free exchange of animals. So in the early Cenozoic, there was a brief period also where a crossing between North America and Europe via the United Kingdom and Greenland would have been possible when sea levels were low due to glacial periods. Now, to be very clear, very, very clear, this would have been an extremely difficult crossing, okay? But it's theorized it would have just about been doable. Or you could obviously also use the ice sheet as a land bridge to get from one continent to another if you're willing to risk walking across a giant glacier. So the exchange of horses and camels between Asia and North America is a good example of this exchange between the continents. So the most important exchange in reference to North America and South America is the exchange that occurred essentially when South America made contact with what is now considered modern-day Central America. So in the early Cenozoic, Africa was isolated. I was going to talk about Africa first, sorry. In the early Cenozoic, Africa was isolated. However, in the Miocene, it made contact with Eurasia, so that's Europe and Asia. And this allowed for sporadic faunal interchange, for instance, the elephants and the mammoths making their way out of Africa into Europe and Asia. With reference to South America, it was isolated from the end of the Cretaceous until the start of the Pliocene, so about 5 million years ago. So South America built up its own distinct fauna during that time period. And it had both pouched mammals and placental mammals. Now, during this period of isolation, South America developed a unique mammalian fauna consisting of marsupials and obviously several orders of placental mammals. Excuse me. So, when the collision between South America and Central America occurred, obviously you then had a land bridge that would allow organisms to move either north or south. And as a result of that, we have what's referred to as the Great American Interchange. And during the Great American Interchange, we see 50% of South America's mammalian fauna come from the north, and only 20% of North America's fauna came from the south. So we see an interchange of species. We see 50% of the species we now see in South America migrating south, and only 20% of the species we see in North America migrated north. So what happens is, as you can see, we have a bit of a difference. So in terms of species that came south, you've got bears, tapirs, camels, squirrels, horses, mastodons, cats, and deer move from the south, and they become pretty well established in South America. They're still around mostly now. On the other hand, moving north, we have animals like the ground sloth, the glyptodont, we have the armadillos and the possums. Well, the ground sloths and the glyptodonts, they aren't around anymore. They didn't survive. Armadillos and possums, they did establish themselves very well, and they're still around now. So there was some exchange, but the vast majority of the exchange was North American species moving into South America. And what tended to happen is the placental mammal species from North America would move south, and they would often very rapidly outcompete the marsupial species in South America. So Australia has remained isolated since it separated from North America in the late Cretaceous. The marsupial population has diversified and is very dominant over the placental mammal. So, in terms of Australia, the vast majority of mammals there are marsupials. So many placental mammals in Australia, like rodents and bats, were not introduced until the arrival of colonial explorers and settlers, and they're actually considered pests, and they're actively hunted. So Australia actually has very, very strict laws to help protect its fauna. You have to be, if you're going to bring in any kind of placental mammal, you have to, you have to pass a lot of restrictions in order to actually be able to bring that organism into Australia. Okay, so now let's think about what happens at the end of the Pleistocene extinctions. So during the Pleistocene, the continental interior of North America was stuffed with horses, rhinos, camels, mammoths, mastodons, bisons, giant ground slopes, glyptodons, saber-toothed cats, direwolves, rodents, rabbits. It was a smorgasbord of mammals. So around 14,000 years ago, many of these animals became extinct, especially the larger ones. So unlike previous extinctions, the losses were primarily focused on larger animals, typically greater than 44 kilograms, and mostly mammals in North America, South America, and Australia. So to be clear, typically when there's a mass extinction, normally large animals do suffer more than smaller animals. However, in this case, it's a bit weird in that the extinction that we have at the end of the Pleistocene really focused on the larger mammals. And so that's a bit strange. The other thing that's a bit strange is the extinctions themselves were mostly focused on North America, South America, and Australia. On the whole, Europe, Africa, and Asia were far less affected. So we have to try and explain why that's occurring as well. So in Australia, 15 out of the 16 genuses of large mammals died out. In North America, 33 out of 58. And in South America, 46 out of 58. So you had a very high rate of attrition at the end of the Pleistocene, especially when it came to the larger animals. So something significant clearly happened on these continents. In contrast, Europe lost about 7 out of 23, and Africa, south of the Sahara, lost only 2 out of 44. So for some strange reason, Europe and Africa, on the whole, got away with these extinctions. So the question is, why? So there are 3 questions that have to be fully answered. Number 1, what caused the Pleistocene extinctions? Number 2, why did these extinctions preferentially eliminate large mammals only? And number 3, why were the extinctions focused on the Americas and Australia? So at present there are 2 competing hypotheses. There's the climate change hypothesis, and that simply says rapid climate change at the end of the Pleistocene changed habitats, driving extinctions. And then we have the other hypothesis, which is called the prehistoric overkill hypothesis, and that simply states humans are responsible because mammoth tasted great. So let's think about the climate change hypothesis first. So rapid climate change and obviously respective changes in vegetation occurred as the glaciers retreated during the Pleistocene. That cannot be argued with. So the North American and Northern Eurasian open steppe tundra were replaced with conifers and broadleaf forest as warmer and wetter conditions became the norm. So it seems a bit strange when you think of modern day tundra. Modern day tundra is a very unproductive place. If you want to, if you're an animal and you want to live in that environment, it's pretty hard work. However, the tundra that was around during the last ice age actually appears to have been extremely productive. That's how it could support very large animals like mammoths. Sorry about that. Hit the button at the wrong time there. So, so we can see that towards the end of the last ice age, we see this very productive tundra disappear. And obviously that's going to put a lot of stress on the animals that live in that environment, like mammoths, giant bison, all the rest. So, it's very obvious that that's going to, be a logical explanation as to what caused the extinction. So the Arctic region flora changed from a surprisingly productive herbaceous environment capable of supporting numerous animal species to a waterlogged tundra as the climate became wetter, and this waterlogged tundra is nowhere near as good. In contrast, the southwestern United States changed from a wet environment with broadleaf trees, grassland, and numerous lakes and rivers which supported deer, bison, saber-toothed cats, and mammoths, to a semi-arid environment which is unable to support a diverse fauna containing large mammals. So we see some areas essentially warmed up and some areas dried out. And so we see these very significant changes in climate, and obviously that's going to have a very significant effect on the organisms living in those environments. So based on these examples, it seems that the change in climate during the Pleistocene could have had a very serious effect on mammal populations. But there's also a few problems with the climate change hypothesis. And these problems include, why did the animals simply not migrate as their preferred climate moved to higher latitudes? So after all, reindeer used to live in France, but as conditions changed and France became warmer, the reindeer migrated north into the Arctic. Why did the rest of the animals not do that? Question number 2. Previous glacial advances and retreats does not seem to have caused mass extinction. So, as we discussed in the previous lecture, the glaciers didn't just move forward in one event and retreat in one event. There were lots of, there's lots of variation. For a period of time, the glaciers would advance, then the glaciers would retreat, then the glaciers would advance, then the glaciers would retreat. And none of these advances or retreats appears to be associated with any kind of extinction, even a small one. And so, obviously brings about the question of, well, why at this final retreat did all of a sudden it cause a mass extinction? And the other question is a very difficult one to answer. So Europe will have had the same climate as North America during the last ice age. So as North America warmed up, so did Europe. However, North America was far more affected by this mass extinction than Europe was. So the question is if both these areas had exactly the same climate, why was North America more affected than Europe? Once again, doesn't really make much sense. So that's when the other hypothesis comes in. That's referred to as the prehistoric overkill hypothesis. And that argues that the mass extinctions experienced in North and South America and Australia actually correlate quite well with the arrival of humans on those continents. So the hypothesis also suggests that as the fauna of these continents were not familiar with humans, they didn't see it as a threat. So they just saw a group of humans walking towards them, they thought, I'll ignore them, and then all of a sudden, that's it for them, game over. So in contrast, the animals in Africa and Europe and also Asia had developed a understandable fear of humans. They knew we were dangerous, they knew we were out to eat them, and so obviously they knew to avoid us. And so that might explain why the extinctions in those areas were less severe. So there are two arguments commonly employed against the overkill hypothesis. The first argument is early humans lived in small scattered communities, so how could a sparsely distributed group of hunters decimate so many species? And that's a really great question. It would be very difficult for a relatively disparate group of humans to actually do that. So the counter-argument to that is, in the space of about 600 years, humans managed to decimate the mammal populations of several Pacific islands. So think of animals like the dodo, for instance, and areas like New Zealand. And so, we managed to kill off several species of flightless birds, the moas being a good example of that. So yes, humans do have the capacity in very small numbers to cause absolutely irreparable harm to the mammal populations in a given area. However, then there's another counter-argument to that, and the counter-argument to that is, well, yes, these settlers that came to the Pacific Islands, well, yes, they did manage to do that, but they were armed with steel weapons and guns. So that's a luxury that early humans did not have. So, these settlers that came to the Pacific Islands, they had modern, up-to-date technology that allowed them to kill large numbers of animals very, very quickly and efficiently. In contrast, early humans would not have had those options. So that's a very serious problem that has to be explained. How can a relatively spread out group of humans actually manage to decimate populations, in some cases over a huge area? North America is not a small area. So the other problem is that hunters wisely go for smaller, less dangerous animals. So so if you're given the choice of hunting a deer or hunting an elephant, I'm going to go pretty much for the deer every single time because it's going to be safer. So the remains of horses, reindeer and other small animals are found at several prehistoric sites. So where we find prehistoric settlements, we find the bones of horses, reindeers and other small animals, which makes sense. Humans are naturally going to hunt the animals they think they can deal with most efficiently. In contrast, mammoth bones and woolly rhinoceros bones, for instance, are rare to non-existent. So what's going on there? So it's also been pointed out that human artifacts are not found among the remains of extinct animals. So where we find a dead mammoth, you could say, right, well, okay, the argument about the bones is, well, maybe they cut the meat off where they killed the mammoths, took the meat back to the camp, but left the bones behind. That's a perfectly reasonable argument. However, in order to do that, they would have used flint knives to cut the meat off. And where we find, mammoth skeletons, we don't find any indications. We don't find pieces of flint, or we don't find, flint knives that got left behind accidentally. So that's a problem. So we don't see any indications of them taking the meat off the bones. Another thing is that, if we do have any kind of sign of butchery, so the meat being cut off the bones, well, those signs are typically very, very rare, and at best the vast majority of them are questionable. So that would suggest that humans weren't actually killing mammoths and, taking the meat off the bone and carrying it back to their camp. So the counter-argument to that is that the impact of human hunting was so swift that the opportunity for substantial numbers of tools to be left at hunting sites was relatively low. So there wasn't time for tools to build up, and so it's very unlikely that we would find them. So that is one argument, but it's a bit of a weak one. So another option that's been suggested is that some have suggested that early hunters may have preferentially targeted the young of the larger mammals. So we wouldn't go after the full-grown mammoths, we would go after the infant mammoths. And then obviously we would butcher those mammoths at the kill site and then take the meat back to the camp. And this offers some explanation. The smaller skeletons are less likely to successfully fossilize, and also because the skeletons are smaller, it means that scavengers would have come along later, and in the process of them trying to get as much meat out of the skeleton as possible, they would have obviously disarticulated the skeleton and spread it out over a large area. That also would have reduced the chances of successful fossilization. So that might help to explain to some degree, why humans did manage to destroy these populations, because we were focusing just on the young. We were avoiding the adults altogether. We were just taking out their children, and that obviously means that the next generation wasn't coming through, and so obviously over time that would lead to a population collapse. And in terms of why we don't see any butchery on the skeletons of these these juvenile mammoths, for instance, well, that's because simply the skeletons just didn't fossilize very well, or they got disarticulated by later scavengers. So, it offers a reasonable explanation. So the reason for this extinction at the end of the last ice age is uncertain. But the most likely explanation is probably a hybrid model. So it probably says, yes, these populations were stressed by climate change, and then all of a sudden we rocked up, and then that was it for them. So, it's probably a mixture of both these models put together. Okay, everybody. Well, that's it for this presentation. So please don't forget, the code word is Oreo, as in the cookie. And, so that's it. Take care, everyone.